I want you to take a second and just, feel the physical weight of your own body right now.
Yeah, just the actual physical gravity.
Exactly. You're probably sitting in a chair or maybe standing, and you can just feel gravity anchoring you down.
Right.
And if you take a deep breath, you can feel the actual physical stretching of your ribs in your lungs.
You really can.
We are so used to experiencing the world through these massive macro-level forces. But the wild part is, deep inside you, the microscopic command centers of your cells, like the nuclei, are dealing with those exact same physical realities.
Oh, absolutely. They're constantly being pushed, pulled, stretched, and well squished.
Right. And the question we are tackling today is, how do they survive that without just popping like a microscopic water balloon?
Which is such a good question because it completely upends the traditional way we were taught biology.
Yeah, I mean, usually we picture the nucleus as this quiet, floating library of DNA, right? Just sort of passively sitting in the fluid of the cell.
But it is anything but passive. It's this highly wired, dynamic piece of engineering that constantly adapts to physical tension and compression to figure out which of your genes it needs to turn on or off.
Which brings us to the actual source material for our deep dive today.
Yes, a really fantastic paper.
Right. We are looking at a really comprehensive snapshot paper from the journal Cell. It's by researchers Bertolaut, Miroshnikova, and Wickstrom, and it's all about mechanotransduction in the nucleus.
Mechanotransduction, yeah.
And our mission here is to map out every single detail of how the nucleus acts as this highly sensitive mechanical fortress.
Exactly.
We're going to look at the bizarre tools scientists use to measure the squishiness of a cell and what happens to human health when this delicate machinery breaks down.
Because to really grasp how the nucleus survives being crushed or pulled, we need to first understand the invisible forces it's fighting against every single second.
Right.
The environment inside your tissue is incredibly hostile and incredibly physical.
And the source material gives us some great real-world examples of these forces. The first one is shear flow.
Yeah, shear flow is a big one.
If you picture the blood rushing through your blood vessels, it's not just a gentle river. That fluid is creating intense friction, constantly brushing and dragging against the endothelial cells lining the walls.
And that dragging force is very different from the second force, which is stretch.
Oh, right, stretch.
Yeah, think about your lungs. Every time you inhale, the alveolar cells in your lung tissue are physically pulled and stretched out like rubber bands.
Wow.
Then there is substrate stiffness. This is the physical resistance a cell feels from its neighborhood.
Like how squishy the tissue around it is.
Exactly. A healthy kidney is relatively soft and pliable, but a diseased, fibrotic kidney is full of dense, stiff scar tissue.
But wait, hold on. How does a cell actually feel stiffness? I mean, a cell doesn't have hands to reach out and squeeze the tissue around it.
That's the crazy part. It feels stiffness by pulling against it, almost like tapping a cane on the ground to see if it's solid concrete or soft mud.
Oh, that's a great analogy.
The cell anchors itself to its surroundings and tugs. If the surrounding tissue is stiff, it pulls back hard. If it's soft, it gives way.
And that physical feedback travels right into the cell.
Right. Then you have compression forces. Immune cells or cancer cells often have to migrate through incredibly dense networks of tissue.
Literally squeezing themselves through spaces that are smaller than their own normal diameter.
Yeah, just mashing themselves through. And lastly, there's hydrostatic pressure.
Right, like in your knees.
Exactly. Every time you take a step, the fluid pressure inside the articular cartilage of your knee pushes back to bear your weight.
So we have dragging, stretching, stiff resistance, squeezing, and pressure. If the nucleus isn't just a water balloon, how is it actually built to withstand all of this?
Well, we have to throw out the water balloon model completely.
You're thrown out.
Think of the nucleus more like a high-tech, tension-stabilized geodesic dome that is hardwired into the surrounding city.
A geodesic dome, I like that.
It starts with the outer boundary. The nucleus has a double lipid bilayer, so an outer membrane and an inner membrane.
And the outer one connects to the rest of the cell, right?
Yes, it's continuous with the endoplasmic reticulum, but it's not a solid wall. It's spanned by nuclear pores.
Now, I always learned that nuclear pores were just tiny doors that let molecules in and out. But the paper points out they are highly dynamic. They actually stretch.
They do. When the cell's membrane experiences elevated physical tension, that force pulls on the lipid bilayer.
Right.
The nuclear pores are embedded in that bilayer, so they physically widen. Their diameter increases.
That's wild.
It is. That stretching literally changes the flow of traffic, dictating which molecules can rush in or out of the nucleus based purely on physical tension.
And right next to those pores, there are dedicated tension sensors. The paper highlights one called piezo-1.
Yes, piezo-1.
It's a mechanosensitive ion channel sitting right there in the endoplasmic reticulum.
And piezo-1 is just a marvel of cellular engineering. It's a channel, a gateway for ions, but it's kept shut under normal conditions.
So how does it open?
When the membrane gets pulled taut by mechanical stress, that tension literally yanks the piezo-1 channel open.
It's purely mechanical.
Purely mechanical. Once it pops open, ions flood through, which sends an immediate chemical alarm bell into the cell.
But a dome needs scaffolding to keep from collapsing, right?
Absolutely. Just inside the inner nuclear membrane, there is a dense meshwork of intermediate filaments called lamins.
Lamins, okay.
And these aren't just rigid steel beams, they act more like memory foam or dynamic shock absorbers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, when mechanical tension hits the nucleus, these lamins actually change their molecular conformation, their shape, to absorb the shock and regulate how rigid the nucleus needs to be.
And to connect that internal scaffolding to the external membrane, the cell uses adapter proteins. The paper talks about one crucial player here called emerin.
Yes, emerin is key. When physical force is applied to the nucleus, emerin changes its phosphorylation status.
Okay, let's translate that for a second. What does changing its phosphorylation status actually do?
Think of phosphorylation as, well, flipping a molecular switch.
Okay.
When the physical tug happens, enzymes attach a phosphate group to emerin. This chemical change alters the protein's physical shape.
So it moves.
It does. It causes it to move and change how it binds to the lamins and the inner nuclear membrane. It's basically turning a physical pull into a structural reinforcement.
Okay, so we have the walls, the stretching doors, the piezo-1 sensors, and the internal lamin scaffolding. But you mentioned earlier that the nucleus is hardwired to the rest of the cell. How does it actually connect to the outside world?
Through this amazing structure called the LINC complex. LINC.
Right, it stands for linker of nucleoskeleton and cytoskeleton.
Exactly. And this complex is made of two main types of proteins, nesprins and sunin proteins.
Nesprins and sun proteins.
Right. They reach across the double membrane of the nucleus and lock together, acting like massive grappling hooks.
Wow, grappling hooks.
Yeah, they anchor the nucleus directly to the cell's external structural cables, the actomyosin, microtubules, and intermediate filaments out in the cytoplasm.
So if I'm picturing this right, the nucleus is suspended in the middle of the cell, tethered in every direction by these LINC complex grappling hooks.
That's it, exactly.
It's like a spider sitting in the center of a web. If anything touches the cell membrane on the far side, the web vibrates, the cables pull, and the nucleus feels it instantly.
That is a brilliant way to visualize it. And the structural integration goes even deeper than that.
Deeper than the LINC complex.
Oh, yeah. Even the DNA inside the nucleus, the actual library of genetic code itself, acts as part of this physical armor.
Okay, I really struggled to wrap my head around this part of the paper. DNA is essentially an instruction manual, right? It's a code. How can information act as a physical load-bearing structure?
It's because of how it's packaged. I mean, human DNA is roughly 2 meters long if you stretched it out.
2 meters in one cell.
In one cell. But it has to fit into a nucleus that is a fraction of the size of a grain of sand. To do that, the cell spools the DNA tightly around proteins.
Right, and this packaged DNA is called chromatin.
Exactly. Now, the super tightly packed, dense regions are called heterochromatin. Because they are packed so incredibly densely, they are physically stiff.
They act like solid blocks.
Yes. While the open, loose regions, euchromatin, are soft.
So it's kind of like comparing a thick, heavy, hardcover dictionary to a loose stack of newspaper clippings.
I love that.
Even though they both just contain words, the tightly bound dictionary can physically prop up a table leg.
Exactly. The cell uses the dense heterochromatin to actually reinforce the physical structure of the nucleus against crushing forces.
Okay, before we dive into how the cell uses this wiring to make decisions, let me just make sure I have this whole physical picture straight in my head. Let's do a quick recap.
Go for it.
We've got a nucleus that is constantly fighting off forces like fluid friction, stretching, and squishing.
Right.
It defends itself using a highly wired dome. First bullet point. The nuclear pores stretch open under tension.
Yes.
Second, the piezo-1 sensors pop open when yanked. Third, the lamin mesh acts like shock absorbers.
Perfect.
Fourth, The LINC complex tethers it to the rest of the cell like a spiderweb. And fifth, even the tightly packed DNA acts as structural reinforcement.
You got it perfectly. It really makes you wonder, when we're just sitting here drinking coffee or walking down the street, what kind of immense physical forces our cells are constantly fighting off just to keep our genetic code intact.
Yeah. So for you listening, think about your own body right now. Can you visualize the constant mechanical tension keeping your cell's command centers intact?
It's mind-blowing.
Which naturally brings us to the next big question. Now that we know the nucleus is physically wired to feel a tug or a squeeze,
Yeah.
what does it actually do with that physical information?
Right. How does a mechanical pull become a biological command?
Exactly.
That is the core of mechanosignaling. It's literally the translation of physics into biology.
Okay, walk us through it.
When the cell gets pulled, the cytoskeleton, that web we talked about, shifts. This tension physically deforms the nucleus.
And when that happens, specific messenger proteins are triggered to rush inside.
Yes. The paper highlights two major mechanosensitive transcription factors, YAPTZ and MRTF.
I love the YAPTZ mechanism. So the cell's under tension, the nuclear pores are physically stretched wide open, and these YAPTZ messengers just rush right through the gates.
They rush right in.
And their primary job is to find the machinery that reads DNA and force it to turn on specific genes.
Exactly. And usually those are genes that tell the cell to build more structural support or to start dividing. It's the cell's way of saying, we are under heavy physical stress, reinforce the walls.
And the cell fine-tunes this response beautifully. Remember those piezo 1 ion channels that popped open under tension?
Right, the ones that let ions in.
Yeah, they specifically let calcium ions flood into the cell. That calcium influx acts as a secondary messenger system, triggering a cascade of reactions inside the nucleus.
The paper also talks about actin shuttling, which is fascinating.
Oh yeah, explain that.
So actin is a protein that usually exists as free-floating little globes called G-actin.
Actin, okay.
But when the cell is under physical stress, it sends a signal to polymerize that actin, meaning it links those little globes together into long, stiff structural cables called F-actin.
Right inside the nucleus.
Yes. The combination of the YAPTZ messengers, the calcium influx, and the rapid building of F-actin cables allows the cell to directly adjust how tightly the chromatin is compacted.
So it physically reorganizes the DNA to turn the right genes on and off to survive the stress.
Exactly.
But what happens when the force is just too much? The paper spends a lot of time on the trauma of extreme deformation.
It does, yeah.
It specifically notes that cells are at a massive risk for DNA damage if they get crushed during the G2S phase of their life cycle. Why is that specific phase so dangerous?
Well, the G2S phase is when the cell is actively copying its DNA to prepare for cell division.
Okay, that makes sense.
And to copy the DNA, it has to unwind those protective, tightly packed schools of heterochromatin we talked about earlier.
Ah, so the dictionary's opened up.
Exactly. The DNA strands are laid bare. They are exposed and fragile. If a massive physical force hits the cell right then, without that dense packaging to absorb the shock, the delicate DNA strands can literally just snap.
Ouch. So how does the cell survive being squeezed through a tight space without its DNA snapping?
The source describes a defense mechanism called yielding.
Yielding.
Yeah. On short timescales, to protect the genome, the cell actively decompacts its heterochromatin. It softens the nucleus on purpose to dissipate the stress.
I have to admit, when I first read this, it felt completely counterintuitive.
Really? How so?
Well, if a massive crushing force is coming at me, I want to become harder. I want a titanium shield, not a marshmallow. Why does it actively soften?
It does seem backward until you think about structural physics. What happens to a rigid, incredibly stiff oak tree when it gets hit by a Category 5 hurricane?
It snaps in half.
Right. Now, what happens to a willow tree?
It bends.
It yields to the wind, and because it's flexible, it survives. If the nuclear membrane remained completely stiff under extreme compression, the pressure would build up until the membrane shattered instantly.
Wow.
By softening the DNA inside, the nucleus acts like a sponge. It yields to the pressure, absorbing and dissipating the kinetic energy, which keeps the outer envelope from tearing apart.
The willow tree analogy makes perfect sense, but the paper outlines what happens when this yielding defense fails, when the deformation is just too large or the nucleus is structurally fragile.
And the consequences are terrifying.
Yeah, the first thing we see is nuclear blebbing.
Blebbing. It's essentially when a weak spot forms in the nuclear membrane and the internal pressure causes it to bubble out.
Like a weak spot on an overinflated bicycle tire. Exactly. And if that bubble pops, we get actual rupture of the nuclear envelope. It's like a breach in the hull of a submarine.
That's a great way to put it.
The hostile environment of the cell's cytoplasm just floods in, and necessary DNA repair proteins are physically excluded from getting back inside to fix the damage.
And worse, things that are supposed to stay outside leak in. Specifically, cytoplasmic exonucleases.
Cytoplasmic exonucleases, those are essentially molecular scissors, right?
Exactly. Molecular scissors designed to shred loose genetic material in the cytoplasm to protect against viruses. But when they leak into a ruptured nucleus, they don't know the difference.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they begin to indiscriminately attack and degrade the cell's own exposed DNA, leading to catastrophic damage and replication stress.
Okay, time for another quick recap to make sure we're tracking all these incredible mechanisms.
Let's do it.
Bullet 1. To translate a physical pull into an instruction, the cell sends YAMTZ and MRTF messengers through those stretched open pores to turn on genes. Bullet 2. It fine-tunes everything by flooding the area with calcium and building actin cables.
Right.
Bullet 3. When things get dangerously squished, it intentionally softens its DNA to bend like a willow tree instead of breaking.
The yielding defense.
And bullet 4. If the pressure's too high, the hull breaches, molecular scissors leak in, and the DNA gets shredded.
It is a phenomenal high-stakes balancing act happening millions of times a day in your body.
So for you listening, what stands out to you about this survival mechanism? Have you ever thought of literally softening yourself as a primary biological defense strategy?
It's a profound concept.
Which naturally leads us to our final section.
Yeah.
The toolkit of discovery and what happens when this delicate balancing act causes human disease.
Right, the clinical side.
I'll be honest, the idea that scientists can measure the stiffness of something smaller than a speck of dust sounds like science fiction.
How do you even poke a nucleus?
Well, the field of mechanobiology has had to invent entirely new ways to interact with the microscopic world, because you obviously can't just put a cell in a tiny vice grip. Let me run through some of the tools mentioned in the text, because they are fascinating. First is atomic force microscopy, or AFM.
A classic.
From what I understand, they take an impossibly microscopic needle attached to a tiny cantilever, and they literally tap the nucleus to measure how much it pushes back, almost like tapping a trampoline.
That's exactly how it works.
Then there is micropipette aspiration. They take a tiny glass tube, place it directly against the nucleus, and apply a very precise vacuum suction.
They literally suck a portion of the nucleus into the tiny tube.
Just to measure how easily the membrane gets sucked up to determine its stiffness.
And those are the physical tools. Then we get to the tools manipulating light and magnetism.
Right. Optical traps, also called optical stretchers, and magnetic tweezers. This blew my mind. How do you pull a nucleus apart with light?
It relies on the physics of light itself. Photons, particles of light, actually carry a tiny amount of momentum.
Okay.
By focusing a highly intense laser beam, scientists can create a gradient of force that physically traps microscopic particles. They can attach tiny beads to the outside of a cell or nucleus, catch those beads in the laser beam, and literally pull them apart to measure the tension.
That is absurd.
And magnetic tweezers work similarly, but they use targeted magnetic fields to pull on microscopic magnetic beads attached to the cell. Plus, they use live loci tracking to watch chromatin mobility and DNA repair in real time.
It is truly incredible technology. But we aren't just stretching cells for the fun of it.
No, not at all.
The paper anchors all this microscopic science to macro-level human suffering. Understanding these structural mechanics explains why certain devastating diseases happen.
It really does.
The text highlights rare genetic disorders, specifically Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, which causes rapid premature aging in children, and Emery-Dreifuss and limb-girdle muscular dystrophies.
And the tragic link between these diseases is that they are caused by mutations in the very architectural genes we just spent the last 10 minutes talking about.
The scaffolding genes.
Exactly. A mutation in the LMNA gene means the cell cannot build the lamin scaffolding correctly. A mutation in the EMD gene means the Emerin adapters don't work.
So the geodesic dome is fundamentally compromised from the moment the cell is born.
Precisely. Without that scaffolding, there's a total loss of nucleocytoskeletal coupling.
The spider is disconnected from its web.
Yes. The nucleus becomes horribly deformed, transport through the pores breaks down, and the membrane becomes extremely fragile.
That sounds disastrous.
It is. Now think about what happens when you put a fragile, unreinforced nucleus inside a highly mechanical tissue. like a skeletal muscle that is constantly contracting, or a heart that beats 100,000 times a day.
Oh my God. Every time the muscle flexes, it's crushing a nucleus that has no shock absorbers.
Yes. In muscular dystrophies, this continuous repetitive mechanical trauma leads to constant nuclear rupture, DNA damage, and eventually massive cell death.
So at the macro level, this manifests as muscle wasting, severe weakness, and cardiomyopathy.
The heart literally destroys its own cells just by beating.
That is heartbreaking, but from a mechanical perspective, it makes total sense.
It does.
The paper also brings up a disease that affects millions more people: cancer. Solid tumors completely remodel their physical environment, don't they?
They do. A growing tumor creates a dense, stiff, highly pressurized environment. Cancer cells face massive interstitial fluid pressure, compression, and shear stress.
A normal cell would rupture or shut down under that stress.
But cancer cells hack the system. That massive pressure triggers the Y-epitacy mechanosignaling pathway we talked about.
Oh, the messengers.
Right. But instead of just reinforcing the cell, the cancer uses those messengers to drive relentless proliferation and anti-apoptosis, turning the cell into an invasive tank that refuses to die.
The text mentions that clinicians actually use nuclear shape abnormalities for cancer diagnosis and staging. They look at a biopsy and search for nuclei that have deep folds, dents, grooves, and weird inclusions.
They do. It's a hallmark of cancer.
So if I'm understanding this correctly, a highly deformed, dented nucleus under a microscope isn't just a random error.
No, it's not.
It's essentially a battle scar. It tells the doctor that this specific cell has successfully hacked its mechanical pathways to survive a crushing tumor environment, making it more dangerous and more likely to spread.
You've hit the nail on the head. Those abnormal shapes are physical evidence of a hyperactive mechanosignaling state. Why? The cell has adapted to extreme stress, which is why those highly deformed nuclei are strongly associated with a poor prognosis for the patient. The cell is primed to survive anywhere.
And the text mentions fibrosis too, right?
Yeah, we see a similar pathology in fibrosis where tissue becomes abnormally stiff from scarring. The stiffness constantly pulls on the cells, tricking them into a state of structural panic, which just drives more pathological mechanosignaling and more scarring.
Okay, let's do one final recap of the real-world impact before we wrap up.
Sounds good.
Bullet 1. We've learned that researchers are using literal microscopic tractor beams of light and suction tubes to poke and prod at the nucleus. Bullet 2. We've seen that if the genetic code for the cell's internal scaffolding like lamins and emrin is mutated, the nucleus shatters under the normal pressure of a beating heart, causing things like progeria and muscular dystrophy.
Right.
And bullet 3, we've seen how cancer cells hijack their own structural sensors to survive high-pressure tumors, shape-shifting and leaving behind deformed nuclei that oncologists use to stage the disease.
That's all connected.
So for you listening, knowing that the literal shape of a nucleus is used to stage cancer, does it change how you view the physical structure of illness?
When you look at illness through this lens, it profoundly changes your perspective. It's not just about chemical imbalances or rogue genes. It is about physical geometry and structural failure.
It is a heavy realization, but an incredibly important one. As we bring this deep dive to a close, what is the ultimate synthesis from this cell paper?
The core insight is the reciprocal, unbreakable loop between nuclear mechanics, the architecture of our genome, and the fate of our cells.
It's a loop.
Yes. The physical forces a cell experiences dictate the shape of its DNA. The shape of the DNA dictates which genes are read, and those genes dictate how the cell behaves. It proves that it's not just chemistry. Physics is actively directing biology. We're really just at the starting line of unraveling these molecular mechanisms with high-resolution imaging. But the hope is that by understanding the structural rules of the nucleus, we can pioneer entirely new diagnostic and treatment modalities.
It really is a whole new frontier of medicine. I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over.
It's a good one.
If the microscopic command centers of your cells are constantly reshaping themselves based on the physical stresses they endure, literally softening to survive a crush, changing their DNA architecture when pulled, how might the macro-level physical environments we subject our bodies to every single day be literally rewriting our biological instructions from the inside out?
It forces you to respect the cellular impact of every physical movement you make.
Exactly. Think about that the next time you stretch. Take a deep breath or go for a run. You aren't just moving muscles. You are sending physical force signals straight into the vault of your genetic code. Until our next deep dive, keep questioning the world around you and the microscopic worlds within you.